The relentless sun beat down on Gallows Valley, scorching the once fertile grasslands into a desolate wasteland of cracked earth and withered dreams. 3 months without rain had transformed this thriving cattle country into a desperate struggle for survival. But the drought wasn't the worst enemy these ranchers faced. Jeb Calloway stood on his porch, squinting at the barren horizon as he wiped sweat from his weathered brows. His cattle, once proud and fat, now resembled walking skeletons, their ribs protruding painfully against dusty hides. The watering hole on his property had dried up weeks ago, leaving him with just one option: the public spring at Silver Creek. "Pa, are you sure this is wise?" his son Thomas asked, concern etched across his young face. "McGraw's men have been turning folks away." Jeb's jaw tightened as he secured his canteen to his saddle. "Public water ain't owned by any man, son. Not even Hollis McGraw." The name alone sent a chill through the scorching air. Hollis McGraw, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, whose sprawling ranch encompassed the valley's most vital resource, the headwaters of Silver Creek. While other ranchers watched their livelihoods wither away, McGraw's herds remained fat and his coffers overflowed. Jeb rode for hours across the parched landscape, the hollow sound of his horse's hooves against the dried earth echoing the emptiness in his stomach. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving what little food remained for his wife and children. As he approached Silver Creek, the distant sound of voices carried on the hot wind. Drawing closer, Jeb's heart sank. McGraw's men had constructed a massive wooden dam, diverting the precious water toward McGraw's lands while leaving only a trickle downstream. A half-dozen armed men stood guard, led by Dane Sutter, McGraw's notorious enforcer, whose cold eyes had witnessed the deaths of countless men. "That's far enough, Calloway," Sutter called out, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "This water ain't free anymore." Jeb dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Silver Creek's been public water since before our grandfathers were born, Sutter. You've got no right." Sutter's thin lips curved into a mirthless smile. "Rights? The only right that matters in this valley is might, and Mr. McGraw's got plenty of that." He gestured toward the dam. "Water access is $5 per bucket now, or 1 head of cattle per week. Mr. McGraw's generous terms." "That's robbery," Jeb growled, stepping forward. "You're condemning families to death." Sutter's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease. "Last warning, Calloway. Pay up or ride away, or don't ride away at all." Outnumbered and outgunned, Jeb felt the bitter taste of defeat fill his mouth. Without water, his cattle would die within days. Without cattle, his family would soon follow. McGraw wasn't just taking their water. He was starving the entire valley into submission. "This ain't over," Jeb muttered, turning back to his horse. "Oh, but it is," Sutter called after him. "McGraw owns this valley now. The sooner you accept that, the longer you'll live." If you thought this standoff was intense, wait until you see how McGraw punishes those who dare to resist his iron grip. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever stood up to a bully who seemed too powerful to challenge. The McGraw mansion stood like a gleaming fortress atop the highest hill in the valley, its pristine white columns and sprawling verandas visible for miles, a deliberate reminder of who ruled these lands. Inside the opulent dining room, Hollis McGraw held court, swirling brandy in a crystal glass as he entertained his business associates from the east. "Gentlemen," McGraw announced, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who had never heard the word no. "Within 6 months, I'll own every inch of this valley." He gestured expansively toward the window, where his lush, irrigated field stood in stark contrast to the dying land beyond. "The drought is simply expediting my timeline." The businessmen chuckled, raising their glasses in appreciation of McGraw's ruthless strategy. At dawn the next morning, Dane Sutter led a dozen men on a raid of the Pearson family ranch. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they surrounded the modest homestead, rifles gleaming in the early morning light. "Please," Martha Pearson begged, clutching her young daughter to her chest as Sutter's men began driving away their remaining cattle. "Those are our last animals. We'll starve." Sutter dismounted, towering over the desperate woman. "You've missed 2 water payments. Mr. McGraw is merely collecting what he's owed." He nodded to his men, who proceeded to the barn, emerging with kerosene. "This is your final warning. Next time, it won't just be the barn." Across the valley, similar scenes played out with mechanical precision. McGraw's operation wasn't just business. It was a siege designed to break the will of every independent rancher until they abandoned their lands or pledged fealty to his growing empire. By midday, Silas Redding, whose family had ranched in the valley for 3 generations, rode to McGraw's estate. His hat clutched in trembling hands, the once proud rancher now stood before McGraw like a beggar. "Mr. McGraw, I've come to offer you my best breeding stock, 20 heads of prime Hereford cattle, in exchange for water rights through autumn," Silas said, his voice strained but dignified. McGraw examined his fingernails, not bothering to look at the old man. "Your entire herd isn't worth access to my water, Redding, but your land adjoins my eastern pasture quite nicely." "I can't sell my land," Silas protested. "It's all my family has." McGraw finally looked up, his eyes cold. "Then you have nothing I want." He nodded to Sutter. "Show Mr. Redding what happens to those who waste my time." That evening, the valley watched in horror as flames engulfed Silas Redding's barn and homestead, the fire visible for miles in the darkening sky. In town, Jeb Calloway addressed a gathering of ranchers in the back room of the saloon. "We can't fight him separately," he urged. "McGraw will pick us off one by one." "And what would you have us do?" challenged Wilhelm Schmidt, whose rivalry with Jeb dated back decades. "Start a war we can't win?" From the corner, Eloise Carrington stepped forward. Since McGraw's men had accidentally trampled her husband during a raid last spring, the widow had managed their ranch alone. "While you men nurse your grudges," she said sharply, "McGraw grows stronger. James died because you all stood divided. How many more will we lose before you realize old feuds are luxuries we cannot afford?" Her words hung in the air, but decades of rivalry wouldn't dissolve overnight. The meeting ended with more arguments than solutions. Dawn broke across the drought-stricken valley as Jeb Calloway guided his horse up the winding trail toward the Hayes Ranch. His stomach churned with every step, pride and desperation warring within him. He'd sworn 5 years ago never to speak to Declan Hayes again, not after Hayes had accused him of stealing water rights during the last dry spell, an accusation that had nearly led to bloodshed. The Hayes property remained a testament to Declan's business acumen. While not as ostentatious as McGraw's empire, his ranch had weathered the drought better than most, with deeper wells and careful management keeping his cattle alive, if not thriving. As Jeb approached the main house, he spotted Declan on the porch, shotgun resting casually across his lap. "That's close enough, Calloway," Declan called out, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "Never thought I'd see you riding onto my land voluntarily." Jeb dismounted slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Wouldn't be here if I had any other choice, Hayes." Declan's weathered face remained impassive as he studied his former friend. "McGraw's men came sniffing around yesterday. Figured it wouldn't be long before someone broke ranks." "I'm not here to surrender," Jeb said, stepping forward. "I'm here because McGraw won't stop with the small ranches. Once he's squeezed us dry, you'll be next. We need to stand together." A bark of laughter escaped Declan's lips as he stood, towering over Jeb from the elevated porch. "Stand together? Where was this unity when you were diverting water from my stream 5 years back?" "I never touched your water," Jeb growled, old anger flaring. "But that doesn't matter now. McGraw is strangling the entire valley, and your deeper wells won't save you forever." Declan descended the steps slowly, shotgun still in hand. "I've got an agreement with McGraw. 200 head of cattle each season in exchange for guaranteed water rights. It's steep, but we're managing." "And you trust him to honor that?" Jeb challenged. "The man burned Silas Redding out yesterday after Silas offered his prize breeding stock. McGraw doesn't want partners. He wants servants. Something flickered across Declan's face, doubt perhaps, but it hardened again into stubborn resolve. My father built this ranch from nothing, Calloway. I won't risk it on some fool's crusade against a man with an army at his disposal. Now get off my property. Jeb turned back to his horse, frustration and despair threatening to overwhelm him. He'd known this was a long shot, but without Hayes, there was little hope of mounting any meaningful resistance. That night, as Declan sat down to dinner with his younger brother Finn, the sound of gunfire shattered the evening quiet. Rushing outside, they witnessed a horrifying sight. McGraw's men had surrounded their cattle pens and were setting them ablaze. Cattle bellowed in panic, trampling each other as they tried to escape the flames. "Finn, no!" Declan shouted as his impetuous younger brother grabbed a rifle and charged toward the attackers. Gunfire erupted, a bullet grazing Finn's shoulder and sending him sprawling into the dirt. By the time Declan had dragged his brother to safety behind a water trough, McGraw's men were already riding away, their laughter carrying on the night wind. Standing amid the charred remains of his cattle pens, holding his wounded brother, Declan Hayes felt something break inside him. The bitter taste of humiliation mixed with a newfound understanding. Jeb Calloway had been right. McGraw wouldn't stop until he owned everything. The abandoned Davis barn stood on the outskirts of town, its weathered planks offering just enough shelter from prying eyes. As midnight approached, riders arrived in ones and twos, tethering their horses in the shadows before slipping inside. Lantern light cast elongated shadows across the dusty floorboards as Jeb Calloway surveyed the gathering. 8 ranchers had answered his call, fewer than he'd hoped, but more than he'd expected. They sat on hay bales and upturned crates, wariness etched into their features. Lifelong rivals and neighboring ranchers who hadn't spoken in years now found themselves uncomfortable allies in a fight for survival. "Never thought I'd see Wilhelm Schmidt and Tom Baker under the same roof without bloodshed," Eloise Carrington remarked as she entered, her rifle slung casually over her shoulder. The men shifted uncomfortably as she took her place in the circle. "Seems drought and tyranny make for strange bedfellows." Before Jeb could begin, the barn door swung open. Declan Hayes entered, his imposing frame silhouetted against the moonlight, a bandaged Finn trailing behind him. A tense silence fell over the gathering. "Hayes," Jeb acknowledged, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." Declan's face remained stony as he stepped into the lantern light. "McGraw's men shot my brother and burned 30 heads of my best cattle last night. Consider my position reconsidered." Jeb nodded, understanding the cost of Declan's presence. "Everyone here has lost something to McGraw, some more than others." His gaze drifted to Eloise, who stared back unflinchingly. "But tonight, we start taking things back." Wilhelm Schmidt spat on the ground. "Pretty words, Calloway, but McGraw has 40 men on his payroll. We're outnumbered and outgunned." "We don't need to match him man for man," Declan interjected, stepping forward. "We need to hit him where it hurts, his pocket and his pride." The ranchers exchanged skeptical glances as Jeb spread a crude map across a wooden table. "McGraw's power comes from 2 things, water and cattle. We've already tried reasoning about the water and got nowhere. But his cattle, those prized Herefords, he paid a fortune to import from the back east. Those we can take." Tom Baker laughed bitterly. "You're proposing we rustle McGraw's cattle? That's a hanging offense." "So is what he's doing to this valley," Eloise countered sharply. "My husband is dead, the Redding family is homeless, and the rest of you are one bad week away from the same fate. The law won't help us. We need to help ourselves." The barn erupted into arguments, old grievances bubbling to the surface. Wilhelm accused Baker of cowardice. Baker questioned Jeb's leadership. Another rancher suggested they simply abandon the valley altogether. The crack of Eloise's rifle firing into the rafters silenced the room instantly. "My husband is dead because of men like you," she said, her voice deadly calm as she lowered the smoking barrel. Men are too busy fighting each other to recognize the real enemy. I won't watch another family destroyed because of your petty squabbles." In the stunned silence that followed, Declan stepped to Jeb's side at the map table, a gesture not lost on anyone present. "McGraw moves his prize herd to the north pasture every third night," Declan said, pointing to a location. "The guard rotation is lightest before dawn. If we hit them there, we could drive off 200 heads before they know what's happening." Jeb and Declan locked eyes, years of animosity momentarily set aside in the face of a greater threat. "I'll lead from the east," Jeb offered. "And I'll come in from the west," Declan replied, without hesitation. One by one, the ranchers moved toward the table, the alliance tentatively forming before their eyes. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the ink-black sky as Jeb led his group through the shallow creek bed, the water, what little remained, barely reaching their horses' fetlocks. Nearby, hidden by a ridge of sandstone, Declan and his men waited for the signal. The cool night air carried the scent of McGraw's cattle, 200 prime Herefords sleeping peacefully in the north pasture, guarded by just 4 of McGraw's men. "Remember, no shooting unless absolutely necessary," Jeb whispered as they reached their position. "We want the cattle, not a war. Not yet, anyway." Tom Baker nodded nervously, clutching his lariat with white-knuckled hands. Eloise checked her rifle one last time, her eyes sharp in the darkness. On Jeb's signal, she struck a match against her saddle and lit the lantern, swinging it twice in a high arc, the signal for Declan's group to move. The guards never stood a chance. While Declan's men approached from the west, creating a distraction with sudden whoops and hollers, Jeb's group descended on the rear of the herd. With practiced precision, they cut the choicest 100 heads from the sleeping animals and began driving them south, away from McGraw's land. One guard managed to fire his pistol before Eloise's well-aimed shot knocked him from his saddle. The sound echoed through the valley, a signal that their time was running short. "Move!" Jeb shouted, abandoning silence for speed as they pushed the confused cattle forward. Declan's group rejoined them, having secured their own portion of the herd, and together they drove the animals toward Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage that would funnel them to safety. Dawn was breaking as they reached the canyon entrance. Behind them, dust clouds signaled the approach of McGraw's men, at least 20 riders led by Dane Sutter himself, closing fast. "Get the cattle through," Declan ordered, turning his horse to face the oncoming threat. "Jeb, take 4 men and secure the exit. The rest of us will hold them here." Gunfire erupted as McGraw's men came within range. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls as Jeb's group pushed the bellowing cattle deeper into the passage. At the narrowest point, Declan and his volunteers made their stand. Eloise proved herself the best shot among them, her rifle dropping 2 of McGraw's men before they could properly return fire. Outnumbered but holding the superior position, they fought with desperate determination. By the time Sutter ordered a retreat, 3 of McGraw's men lay dead, and the cattle were safely through the canyon. The ranchers had suffered too. Wilhelm Schmidt took a bullet in the shoulder, and another man's horse was shot out from under him. But they had won their first victory. McGraw's prized herd, worth a small fortune, now belonged to the Alliance. Hollis McGraw stood motionless in his study, his face a mask of controlled fury, as Dane Sutter delivered the news of the cattle theft. Outside the window, the morning sun illuminated the valley that had, until yesterday, bowed to his every command. Now, for the first time, defiance had bloomed like an unwelcome weed in his garden of power. "You're certain Calloway and Hayes were leading them?" McGraw asked, his voice dangerously soft. Sutter nodded, a purple bruise blossoming across his jaw where a ricocheting bullet had grazed him. "Yes, sir, and the Carrington widow, too. They've united against you." McGraw turned slowly, his eyes cold as winter. "Then we will make an example so severe that any notion of resistance will be crushed." He reached for his gun belt. "Gather every available man. We will ride to the Calloway ranch at noon." The attack came with the precision of a military operation. 30 riders descended on Jeb Calloway's modest ranch while he was still miles away, celebrating their victory with the other ranchers. Martha Calloway had just enough warning to gather her children and flee to the root cellar as the first torches flew. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning timber as McGraw's men systematically destroyed everything the Calloways had built over 3 generations. The house, the barn, the corrals, all became a raging inferno under the midday sun. Livestock was slaughtered, wells were poisoned, and crops were trampled beneath vengeful hooves. "Burn it all," McGraw ordered from atop his stallion, watching the destruction with clinical detachment. "Let this serve as a message to those who would challenge me." By the time Jeb returned, racing ahead after spotting the smoke from miles away, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins. He found Martha and the children huddled in the root cellar, terrified but alive, the only mercy in an otherwise merciless attack. "They said to tell you this is just the beginning," Martha whispered, clutching their youngest child to her chest. "McGraw said next time, he won't just take our land, he'll take our lives." Jeb surveyed the devastation, his life's work reduced to ash and charred timber. The cattle they'd stolen from McGraw now seemed a hollow victory in the face of such overwhelming retaliation. For a moment, despair threatened to consume him, until he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. Declan Hayes stood beside him, having followed Jeb back to the ranch. His expression was grim as he surveyed the destruction. "My brother and I rode ahead when we saw the smoke," Declan said quietly. "You and your family will stay with us until we can rebuild." Jeb turned, surprise evident on his soot-streaked face. "Why would you do that?" "Because this isn't about our old feud anymore," Declan replied, gesturing toward the ruins. "McGraw won't stop until we're all destroyed or under his boot. The only way to survive is together." That evening, as the Calloway family settled into Declan's guest quarters, the Alliance gathered once more. The victory of their cattle raid was now overshadowed by the brutal reality of McGraw's retribution. It was clear to everyone that stealing cattle wouldn't be enough. "We need to hit him where it truly hurts," Eloise said, her voice hard with resolve. "We need to take back the water." The plan came together over 3 tense days of preparation. Maps were drawn, guard rotations studied, and weapons cleaned and loaded. Every rancher in the Alliance understood the stakes. This would be no simple cattle raid, but a direct assault on the foundation of McGraw's power, his control of Silver Creek. "McGraw's dam is here," Jeb explained, pointing to a crude drawing in the dirt. "It's guarded day and night by at least 6 men, with another 4 patrolling the perimeter. We'll need to split into 3 groups, 1 to create a diversion, 1 to engage the guards, and 1 to plant the dynamite." The word dynamite caused a ripple of unease among the ranchers. This was escalating beyond anything they had imagined when they first came together. "Once we do this, there's no going back," Tom Baker warned, his face solemn in the lantern light. "We'll be declared outlaws for sure." "We're already outlaws in McGraw's eyes," Eloise replied sharply. "The difference is whether we're dead outlaws or living ones." Under a moonless sky, the Alliance made their move. Declan led the first team to the ridge overlooking the dam, where they set fire to carefully placed bundles of oil-soaked hay. As predicted, the sudden blaze drew half the guards away from their posts, racing to stop what they believed was an accidental fire threatening to spread to McGraw's property. With the guards divided, Jeb's team struck from the west, rifles blazing as they charged the remaining men at the dam. The night erupted into chaos, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness, the crack of gunfire echoing across the valley as men on both sides dove for cover. Eloise led the third team, slipping through the firefight with Wilhelm and 2 others. They carried satchels of dynamite, stolen from a mining camp 3 days' ride away. While bullets flew overhead, they worked with frantic precision, placing the charges at the dam's structural weak points. "Fire in the hole!" Wilhelm shouted as they lit the fuses and scrambled for safety. The explosion rocked the valley, a thunderous roar followed by the triumphant sound of splintering wood and rushing water. McGraw's dam, built to divert the creek to his lands alone, collapsed in a spectacular cascade. Water surged downstream, reclaiming its natural path through the valley. By dawn, the Alliance had withdrawn to safety, battered but victorious. 2 of their number had taken bullets, one in the arm, another grazed across the ribs, but all had survived. The same couldn't be said for McGraw's men. 4 lay dead by the ruined dam, with several more wounded. "This changes everything," Declan said as they watched the sun rise over the valley, its light glinting off the newly liberated waters of Silver Creek. "McGraw will come at us with everything he has now." Jeb nodded grimly. "But for the first time since the drought began, we have a fighting chance. The water's flowing to everyone again." Word of the dam's destruction spread through the valley like wildfire. In town, shopkeepers who had feared openly supporting the Alliance now quietly passed supplies to Eloise's network of supporters. The blacksmith refused to shoe McGraw's horses, claiming a sudden shortage of iron. The general store owner mistakenly delivered ammunition to Declan's ranch instead of McGraw's. The balance of power was shifting, one small act of defiance at a time. Hollis McGraw paced the floor of his study like a caged predator, rage emanating from him in almost visible waves. The destruction of his dam had cost him more than water control. It had shattered his aura of invincibility. Through the window, he could see his once lush fields already beginning to brown, his cattle clustering around the diminished water supply that now barely met his own needs. "They've made a mockery of me," he seethed, hurling a crystal tumbler against the wall where it shattered in a spray of glass and whiskey. "Every miserable rancher in this valley now thinks they can defy me." Dane Sutter stood silently by the door, his arm in a sling from a bullet taken during the dam fight. "The locals won't work for us anymore," he reported grimly. "Blacksmith, general store, even the saloon. They're all refusing our business or sabotaging what they do provide." McGraw stopped pacing abruptly, a dangerous calm settling over his features. "Then we'll bring in outsiders. Send telegrams to Tucson and El Paso. I want 20 professional gunmen here within the week. Offer $500 per man, plus a $1,000 bonus for whoever brings me Calloway and Hayes, dead or alive." 3 days later, a procession of hard-faced men rode into the valley, drawn by McGraw's bounty. They weren't cowboys or ranchers, but killers for hire, men whose guns were available to the highest bidder. Each carried notches on their pistols marking previous victims, and they eyed the peaceful valley as wolves might survey a flock of sheep. That same evening, Jeb and Declan rode into town for supplies, unaware of the new threat that had arrived. As they entered the saloon for a celebratory drink, their first moment of relaxation since the battle at the dam, 4 of McGraw's hired guns were already inside, waiting. "That's them," the barkeeper whispered urgently as the 2 ranchers stepped through the batwing doors. "McGraw's brought in professional killers from all over the territory. There's a bounty on your heads!" Before the warning could fully register, gunfire erupted from the corner of the room. Jeb dove behind an overturned table as splinters of wood exploded around him. Declan returned fire, his shot catching one gunman in the shoulder, while another bullet grazed Jeb's temple, leaving a trail of blood down his face. The gunfight was brief, but deadly. Patrons scattered in panic, bottles shattered behind the bar, and Tom Baker, who had been waiting for them inside, took a bullet meant for Declan. As the smoke cleared, 2 of McGraw's men lay dead, but Baker was dying, blood pooling beneath him on the rough wooden floor. "You tell the others," Baker gasped, clutching Jeb's shirt with bloody fingers. "Tell them I died standing, not kneeling to McGraw." As they carried Baker's body out of town, more riders could be seen arriving at McGraw's ranch in the distance, dark silhouettes against the setting sun, each one a harbinger of the bloodshed to come. "He's preparing for war," Declan said grimly, his face streaked with Baker's blood. "Not just against us, but against the entire valley." The temporary elation following the dam's destruction evaporated in an instant. Their victory had pushed McGraw to desperate measures, and innocent blood was already being spilled. "Then we'd better be ready," Jeb replied, his eyes fixed on the distant ranch. "Because I won't let Tom's death be for nothing." The town of Gallows Crossing awakened to an eerie silence. Shopkeepers delayed opening their doors, children were kept indoors, and anxious glances were directed toward the road leading from McGraw's ranch. Everyone could sense the coming storm. Just after noon, the rumble of hoofbeats announced McGraw's arrival. He rode at the head of a column of 20 men, his hired guns flanking him in a display of deadly force. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes cold as they surveyed the town for threats. Word spread quickly. From the outlying ranches, members of the alliance hurried toward town, knowing that McGraw's move against the community center meant he was making his final play for control. By the time McGraw reached the town square, a crowd had gathered. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, farmers and townspeople clustered on the boardwalks, and at the far end of the street, Jeb Calloway and Declan Hayes sat mounted on horseback, flanked by the remaining members of their alliance. McGraw reined his horse to a stop in the center of the street, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "I've come to restore order to this valley," he announced. "Those who have destroyed my property, stolen my livestock, and murdered my men will face justice today." Jeb urged his horse forward, stopping 30 paces from McGraw. "The only justice needed in this valley is for the families you've starved and terrorized," he called back. "The water belongs to everyone, not just the man with the most guns." A murmur of agreement rose from the townspeople. McGraw's expression darkened as he realized the crowd was turning against him. "This is your last chance," McGraw warned, his voice cold. "Surrender Calloway, Hayes, and the Carrington woman, and the rest of you may return to your miserable lives under my generous supervision." Eloise pushed through the crowd, rifle in hand. "My husband died under your generous supervision," she spat. "We'd rather die on our feet than live another day under your boot." More alliance members emerged from side streets and alleyways, weapons drawn. The townspeople, emboldened by their show of resistance, began to form a united front. Storekeepers, blacksmiths, bartenders, and ranchers standing shoulder to shoulder. McGraw's face contorted with rage. "So be it," he snarled, drawing his pistol. "Kill them all." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As McGraw's men reached for their weapons, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. Dane Sutter, McGraw's loyal enforcer for years, had fired, not at the Alliance, but at the gunman beside McGraw. "Enough," Sutter shouted, his gun now trained on his former employer. "These are our neighbors, not your personal enemies." Chaos erupted as gunfire blazed from all directions. Townsfolk dove for cover as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. McGraw's hired guns, deadly as they were, found themselves surrounded and outmaneuvered by people fighting for their homes and families. In the confusion, McGraw spurred his horse toward an alley, seeking escape as his men fell around him. Jeb and Declan spotted his retreat and gave chase, weaving through the gunfight to follow the architect of the valley's suffering. The three men converged in the dusty space behind the general store. McGraw cornered at last, his face twisted with hatred and disbelief as his empire crumbled around him. "It was never supposed to end this way," he said, his hand hovering near his holster. "This valley was mine." "The valley belongs to no one man," Declan replied, his gun steady, "and that was always your mistake." The standoff behind the general store seemed frozen in time. McGraw with his back against the wall, Jeb and Declan facing him with unwavering resolve. The sounds of gunfire from the main street had begun to diminish, suggesting the tide of battle had turned decisively against McGraw's hired guns. "You fools," McGraw sneered, his composure cracking as desperation set in. "You think killing me ends this? Men like me built this country. There will always be another to take my place." Jeb kept his pistol trained on McGraw's chest. "We're not here to kill you, McGraw. We're here to see justice done. You'll stand trial for what you've done to this valley." A bitter laugh escaped McGraw's lips. "Justice? From whom? I own the judges, the marshals. There is no law here but mine." "Not anymore," Declan replied firmly. Your influence dies today, one way or another." McGraw's eyes darted between them, calculating his odds. With the speed of a rattlesnake, his hand dropped to his holster, drawing his ornate silver revolver. Before he could level it, Declan fired. The bullet struck McGraw's shoulder, spinning him against the wall. His gun clattered to the dirt as he slumped down, clutching his bleeding wound. They marched the wounded cattle baron back to the town square, where the remaining gunfight had resolved into an eerie calm. Bodies of hired guns lay scattered across the street, while the Alliance members tended to their wounded. The townsfolk emerged slowly from their hiding places, witnessing McGraw's humiliating defeat. Dane Sutter stood among the survivors, his betrayal of McGraw having turned the tide of battle at its critical moment. 3 of McGraw's men had surrendered once their employer fled, throwing down their weapons rather than die for a lost cause. "It's over," Jeb announced, pushing McGraw forward for all to see. "The water flows free again. No man will hold this valley hostage anymore." McGraw, bleeding and defeated, still managed a venomous glare. "You've won nothing. Without me, this valley will wither and die. You need a strong hand to guide you through the drought." "We'll guide ourselves," Eloise declared, stepping forward from the crowd. Blood stained her sleeve where a bullet had grazed her, but her eyes shone with fierce pride. "Together." Sheriff Mills, who had conveniently been absent during McGraw's reign of terror, finally emerged from his office. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, he approached with manacles ready. "Hollis McGraw, you're under arrest for murder, extortion, and destruction of property," he declared with newfound courage. As McGraw was led away, the gathered crowd's silence gave way to a growing cheer. Ranch hands embraced shopkeepers, farmers shook hands with ranchers, and children emerged from hiding to witness the dawn of a new era. 3 months after McGraw's downfall, rain finally blessed Gallows Valley. The gentle shower lasted for 2 days, soaking the parched earth and bringing new life to land that had nearly surrendered to the drought. As if nature itself was acknowledging the courage of those who had fought for justice, green shoots began to appear across the once barren landscape. In the town hall, representatives from every ranch and farm in the valley gathered around a massive oak table. At its center lay a document, the Valley Water Compact, bearing the signatures of all present. The compact established shared water rights, ensuring that no single person could ever again control the lifeblood of their community. With these signatures, Eloise announced, having been elected as the committee's chairwoman, we formalize what we fought for, water rights distributed fairly among all who work this land. Jeb and Declan, sitting side by side, exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. Their rivalry, once bitter enough to divide the valley, had transformed into a partnership that had helped save it. "What happened to McGraw?" asked a young rancher from the back of the room. "Federal marshals took him to stand trial in Denver," Sheriff Mills reported. "With testimony from half the valley, including Dane Sutter, he won't see freedom again in this lifetime." Outside, children played in puddles that dotted the muddy main street, their laughter a sound that had been scarce during the darkest days of McGraw's reign. Ranchers who had once seen each other as competitors now shared breeding stock and equipment, understanding that their strength lay in cooperation rather than isolation. As the meeting concluded, Jeb walked to the edge of town, gazing out at the valley stretching before him. The land still bore scars from the drought and the violence, but new growth was already erasing the worst of the damage. Declan joined him, hands in his pockets. "Think we'll have trouble again?" "Probably," Jeb replied honestly. "Another drought, another McGraw, something always comes." "And we'll be ready," Declan nodded, extending his hand. Jeb clasped it firmly. "Together." If you thought this story was satisfying, wait until you hear what happens in our next Western tale.